Hi, I'm April Pashota, the librarian here at Peter B. I'm reading Chapter 17 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, The Hunting of the White Stag. The battle was all over a few minutes after their arrival. Most of the enemy had been killed in the first charge of Aslan and his companions, and when those who were still living saw that the witch was dead, they either gave themselves up or took flight. And the next thing that Lucy knew was that Peter and Adam were shaking hands. It was strange to see her Peter not looking as he looked now. His face was so pale and stern, and he seemed so much older. "It was all Edmund's doing, Aslan," Peter was saying. "We would have been beaten if it hadn't been for him. The witch is turning our troops into stones right and left, but nothing would stop him. He fought his way through those ogres to where she was turning one of your leopards into a statue. And when he reached, he had a sense to bring his sword smashing down on her wand instead of trying to go for her directly, and simply made a statue of himself for his pains. That was the mistake all the rest were making. Once her wand was broken, we began to have some chance. If we hadn't lost so many already. He was terribly wounded. We must go and see him." They found Edmund in charge of Mrs. Beaver a little way back from the fighting line. He was covered with blood, and his mouth was open, and his fat face a nasty green color. "Quick, Lucy," said Aslan. And then, almost for the first time, Lucy remembered the precious cordial that had been given to her for a Christmas present. Her hands trembled so much she could hardly undo the stopper, but she managed, and in the end poured a few drops into her brother's mouth. "There are other people wounded," said Aslan, while she was still looking eagerly into Edmund's pale face and wondering if the cordial would have any result. "Yes, I know," Lucy said crossly. "Wait a minute." "Daughter of Eve," said Aslan in a graver voice, "others also are at the point of death. Must more people die for Edmund?" "I'm sorry, Aslan," said Lucy, getting up and going with him, and for the next half hour they were busy, attending to the wounded while he restored those who had been turned into stone. When at last she came free to come back to Edmund, she found him standing on his feet, and not only healed of his wounds, but looking better than she had ever seen him look. Oh, for ages. In fact, ever since his first term at that horrid school, where he had begun to go wrong. He had become his old self again, and look you in the face, and there was much on the field of battle that Aslan made him into a knight. "Does he know," whispered Lucy to Susan, "what Aslan did for him? Does he know what the arrangement with the witch really was?" "Hush, of course not. No," said Susan. "Oughtn't he be told?" asked Lucy. "Oh, surely not," said Susan. "It would be too awful for him. Think of how you'd feel if you were he." "All the same, I think you ought to know," said Lucy, but at that moment they were interrupted. That night they slept where they were. How Aslan provided food for all of them, I don't know, but somehow or other they found themselves all sitting down on the grass to a fine tea about 8 o'clock. Next day they began marching eastward down the side of the great river, and the next day after that, at about tea time, they actually reached the mouth. The castle of Carapavel on its own little hill towered over above them. Before them were the sands, with rocks and little pools of salt water and seaweed, and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish-green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls! Have you ever heard it? Can you remember? That evening after tea, the 4 children all managed to get down to the beach again and get their shoes and stockings off and feel the sand between their toes. But the next day was more solemn. From then, in the great hall of Carapavel, that wonderful hall with the ivory roof and the west wing, hung with peacock feathers, and the eastern door which looked towards the sea, and the presence of all their friends, and the sound of trumpets, Aslan solemnly crowned them, and led them to the 4 thrones, amid deafening shouts of "Long live King Peter! Long live Queen Susan! Long live King Edmund! Long live Queen Lucy!" "Once a king or queen in the Narnia, always a king or queen. Bear it well, sons of Adam, bear it well, daughters of Eve," said Aslan. And through the eastern door, which was wide open, came the voices of mermen, and the mermaids swimming close enough to the shore and singing in honor of their new kings and queens. So the children sat on their thrones, and the scepters were put into their hands, and they gave rewards and honors to all their friends. To Tuminus the fawn, and the beavers, and the giant Rumblebuffin, to the leopards, the good centaurs, and the good dwarves, and to the lion. And that night there was a great feast in Carapavel, and revelry and dancing, and the gold flashed, and wine flowed, and answering to the music inside. But stranger, sweeter, and more piercing came the music of the sea people. But amid all these rejoicings, Aslan himself quietly slipped away, and when the kings and queens noticed he wasn't there, they said nothing about it. For Mr. Beaver had warned them. "He'll be coming and going," he had said. "One day you'll see him and another you won't. He doesn't like being tied down, and of course he has other countries to attend to. It's quite all right. He'll often drop in. Only you mustn't press him. He's wild, you know, not like a tame lion." And now, as you see, the story is nearly, but not quite, to an end. These 2 kings and 2 queens governed Narnia well, and long and happy was their reign. At first, much of their time was spent in seeking the remnants of the White Witch's army and destroying them. And indeed, for a long time there would be news of evil things lurking in the wilder parts of the forest. A haunting here and a killing there, and a glimpse of a werewolf one month and a rumor of a hag the next. But in the end, all that foul brood was stamped out, and they made good laws and kept the peace and saved good trees from being unnecessarily cut down, and liberated young dwarves and young satyrs from being sent to school, and generally stopped busybodies and interferers and encouraged ordinary people who wanted to live and let live. And they drove back the fierce giants, quite a different sort from the giant Rumblebluffin, and in the north of Narnia where these ventured further across the frontier. And they entered into friendship and alliance with all the countries behind the sea, and paid them visits of state and received visits of state from them. And they themselves grew and changed as the years passed over them. Peter became a tall and deep-chested man and a great warrior, and he was called King Peter the Magnificent. And Susan grew into a tall and gracious woman with black hair that fell almost to her feet, and the kings of the countries beyond the sea began to send ambassadors to ask for her hand in marriage. And she was called Susan the Gentle. Edmund was a graver and quieter man than Peter, and great counsel and in judgment. He was called King Edward the Just. But as for Lucy, she was always gay and golden hair, and all the princes in those parts desired for her to be their queen, and her own people called her Queen Lucy the Valiant. And so they lived in great joy, and if ever they remember their life in this world, it was only as one remembers a dream. And one year it fell out that Tuminus, who was middle-aged faun by now, and beginning to be stout, came down river and brought them the news that the white stag had once more appeared in their parts. The white stag would give you wishes if you caught him. So these 2 kings and 2 queens, with the principal members of their court, rode a-hunting with horns and hounds in the western woods to follow the white stag. And they had not hunted long before they had a sight. And they led him through a great pace over rough and smooth, and through thick and thin, till the horses of all the courtiers were tired out, and only these 4 were still following. And they saw the stag enter into a thicket where the horses could not follow. Then said King Peter, for they talked in quite different style now, having been kings and queens for so long, "Fair consorts, let us now alight from our horses, and follow this beast into the thicket, for in all my days I have never hunted a nobler quarry." "Sir," said the others, "ever let us do so." And so they alighted, tied their horses to trees, and went into the thicket wood on foot. And as soon as they had entered it, Queen Susan said, "Fair friends, here is a great marvel, for I seem to see the tree of iron." "Madam," said King Edmund, "if you look well upon it, you shall see it is a pillar of iron with a lantern set on the top thereof." "By the lion's mane, a strange device," said King Peter, "to set a lantern here where the trees cluster is so thick about it, and so high above it, if it were lit, it should give light to no man." "Sir," said Queen Lucy, "by likelihood when this post and this lamp were set here, there were smaller trees, or fewer, or maybe none. For this as a young wood, and the iron post is old." And they stood looking upon it, and then said King Edmund, "I know not how it is, but this lamp on the post worketh upon me strangely. It runs in my mind that I have seen the like of it before, as if it were in a dream, or in the dream of a dream." "Sir," they answered all, "it is even so with us also." "And more," said Queen Lucy, "for it will not get out of my mind that if we pass this post or lantern, either shall we find strange adventures, or else something great change in our fortunes." "Madam," said King Edmund, "like the foreboding stirreth in my heart also." "And in mine, fair brother," said King Peter. "And in mine too," said Queen Susan. "Wherefore, by my counsel, we shall lightly return to our horse, and follow this white stag no further." "Madam," said King Peter, "therein I pray thee have to me be excused. For never since we four were kings and queens in Narnia have we set our hands to any higher matter, as battles, quest, feats of arm, acts of justice, and the like, they given over, but always what we have taken in hand, the same we have achieved. Sister, said Queen Lucy, my royal brother speaks rightly, and it seems to me we should be shamed for fearing any foreboding as we turn back from such following a noble beast as we now have in chase. And so I say, said King Edmund, I have such a desire to find the signification of this thing that I would not by my good turn back for the richest jewel in all of Narnia and all the islands. Then in the name of Aslan, said Queen Susan, if ye will have all to do it, let us go and take upon the adventure that shall fall to us. So these kings and queens entered the thicket, and before they had gone a score of paces, they all remembered that the thing they had seen was called a lamp-post. And before they had gone 20 or more, they noticed they were making their way through branches, but through coats. And the next moment they came all tumbling out of a wardrobe door into the empty room. And they were no longer kings and queens in their hunting array, but just Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy, in their old clothes. It was the same day and the same hour of day on which they had all gone into the wardrobe to hide. Mrs. Macready and the visitors were still talking in the passage, but luckily they had never came into the empty room, so the children weren't caught. And that would have been the very end of the story. If it hadn't been, then they felt they really must explain to the professor why all 4 of the coats out of his wardrobe were missing. And the professor, who was a very remarkable man, didn't tell them not to be silly or not to tell lies, but believe the whole story. No, he said, I don't think it would be good trying to go back through the wardrobe door to get the coats. You won't get into Narnia again by that route, nor would the coats be much use to you now as you did, eh? What's that? Yes. Of course you'll get back to Narnia again someday. Once a king in Narnia, always a king in Narnia. But don't go trying to use the same route twice. Instead, don't try to get there at all. It'll happen when you're not looking for it. And don't talk too much about it, even among yourselves. And don't mention it to anyone else, unless you find that they've had the adventures of the same sort themselves. What's that? How will you know? Oh, you'll know all right. Odd things, they say, even their looks, will let the secret out. Keep your eyes open. Bless me, what do they teach them at these schools? And that is the very end of the adventure of the wardrobe. But if the professor was right, it was only the beginning of the adventures of Narnia. The end. If you enjoyed The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, C.S. Lewis has written The Chronicles of Narnia, which is a series. I hope you'll read another.